Hey internet friends, have you ever felt like our reality has been flipped upside down? Why is there such a massive distinction between what we're taught in school, what we're told by the media, and the truth we uncover through our own journey? Have you ever noticed that seconds, hours, decades, and centuries tick by on the clock, yet some moments get stuck there between the gears? Over a century ago, in my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, a girl was murdered, and with her body, the truth was buried. Whether by chance or by design, the void was filled with something else entirely. Something that became a legal allegory of sorts, one shrouded in controversy. With the passage of time, facts were watered down and the past was all but erased. Only accessible to those who knew exactly where to look. Which is why we're all here now. Like a phoenix from the ashes of Sherman's march to the sea, Atlanta sprung forth as the gateway to the New South, attracting a diverse array of businesses and workers to Georgia's capital. One of these workers was former farm girl, 13-year-old Mary Fagan, who had recently been laid off at the National Pencil Company, then managed by 29-year-old Superintendent Leo Frank, a man of German Jewish descent who grew up in New York, eventually graduating from Cornell University, and traveled throughout Europe to learn the ways of business. Though he journeyed south only a few years prior to implement his European lessons, Frank made fast friends within his community, becoming president of the Atlanta chapter of B'nai B'rith, which is much like a Masonic society but strictly for Jewish folks that was created in New York after the American Revolution. On Saturday, April 26, 1913, on the day of what was once celebrated as Confederate Memorial Day, little Mary Fagan entered the office of her boss, Leo Frank, to collect her pay of $1.20. Frank would be the last known person to see Mary alive. The next day, in the wee hours of morning, Newt Lee, the night watchman, discovered a horrible scene in the basement of the factory, where Mary's brutally beaten body was left atop of a flurry of pencil shavings, with a cord cinched around her neck, her autopsy later revealing she'd been raped. And beside her corpse were two notes describing her murderer, a long, tall black man called the Night Witch, written through Mary's perspective, as though she jotted it down during her final moments. The black night watchman who discovered Mary's body was immediately brought into the police station as a suspect, and police wasted no time in attempting to get a confession out of him, even going as far as firing off a gun next to his head during the interrogation. But that confession never came. More suspects were arrested as pressure mounted to find Mary's killer, but eventually only two suspects remained. The first was Jim Conley, the pencil factory's black janitor, who held the lowest status job at the factory but was paid 50% more than white child laborers, and held special privilege of never having to punch the clock as granted by Frank, and was seen washing red stains out of his shirt while at the factory, which police later determined to be rust. And the second suspect was Leo Frank, the last person to admit seeing Mary alive. Frank quickly hired the best defense team money could buy to prove his innocence in the murder trial that made front-page headlines that entire summer. In the courtroom and beyond, lies were told, stories rehashed, true character revealed, and bribes offered. The case began to heat up after Conley admitted that he wasn't illiterate like he originally claimed. And in fact, he swore that Leo Frank paid him to write the murder notes, framing Conley's entire involvement as an accomplice in the murder of Mary Fagan, with Leo Frank as the main suspect. Refusing to be cross-examined unlike the other suspects, Frank's story began to unravel as his accounts of what occurred after Mary left his office started to change with each recollection. Originally, Frank swore that he stayed in his office following Mary's departure after receiving her pay envelope. But later, Frank stated he might have taken an unconscious bathroom break that would have placed him walking past the metal room, the site where Mary was believed to have been murdered and at the suspected time when the attack occurred. Another young worker was called to the witness stand, claiming that she had gone to Frank's office right after Mary left, and Frank wasn't there. She even waited around for a bit, but concluded that Frank had gone home for the day. The character witnesses included a string of female employees who all had the same thing to say about Frank. He was a touchy, leery pervert with a penchant for young girls. So after a drawn-out trial that garnered immense public attention, and claims from the prosecution that alleged bribery and witness tampering from Frank's legal team, the grand jury reached a unanimous verdict. A grand jury which, by the way, included Jewish members. They'd all decided that Leo Frank was guilty. After being convicted of murder, the judge sentenced Frank to death by hanging, which was set to be carried out that October, but after Frank's legal team attempted several failed appeals all the way up to the federal level, attorney and Georgia Governor Slayton eventually had Frank's sentence reduced to life in prison. The public response was one of anger, as they believed the justice system had failed the real victim, Mary Fagan, because of under-the-table deals and conflicts of interest, given that Governor Slayton was a partner at the law firm of Frank's defense. On August 16, 1915, a group of about 25 men who called themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan kidnapped Frank from prison and lynched him in Marietta, Georgia, his body facing the direction of the Fagan residence. Though they described themselves as a benevolent organization, by the time Mary Fagan's corpse was 6 feet under Georgia clay, B'nai B'rith had already been publicly accused of espionage during the Civil War and implicated in the assassination of President Lincoln, with the goal of subverting and fragmenting America so that it could once again fall under the British crown, as documented by both Gentile and Jewish scholars alike. During the Civil War, agents of B'nai B'rith even worked in cahoots with Confederate General and Sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite's Southern Jurisdiction, the infamous Freemason known as Albert Pike. It was reported that after Leo Frank was found guilty and convicted of murder, he was once again re-elected as president of B'nai B'rith's Atlanta chapter, whose members were adamant in perpetuating the narrative that Frank's fate relied heavily on Conley's testimony, the testimony of a proven liar and second-class citizen in the post-Civil War South. And B'nai B'rith even went as far as inscribing in stone that everyone in the courtroom during that sweltering southern summer, aside from Frank and his defense team, was either bribed, threatened, or fell under one all-encompassing term: an anti-Semite. The same year, the Federal Reserve System was created and Americans began paying federal income tax. Leo Frank was convicted of murder, and as a result, B'nai B'rith created the Anti-Defamation League, what would serve as the public relations arm of their benevolent organization, with its original mission statement to stop by appeals to reason and conscience, and if necessary, by appeals to law, the defamation of the Jewish people. As the years watered down the public awareness of the Leo Frank trial, the ADL ramped up their campaign to paint Frank as an innocent man and victim of anti-Semitism. Their efforts stretched across various platforms, publications, docu-series, college curriculums, and music theater productions. One retelling of Frank's story portrayed 13-year-old Mary Fagan as a temptress who all but enjoyed being sexually abused by older men. The ADL highlighted racial tensions in the South during that time, but conveniently left out crucial evidence and key witness accounts that ultimately resulted in Frank's conviction. Even in her last will and testament, Frank's Jewish wife stated that she didn't want to be buried next to him. Was she also practicing anti-Semitism? The ADL has never been shy about their objective. Unless they could obtain an official pardon for Leo Frank from the United States legal system, it very much appeared that the organization was created to protect a pedophile murderer who managed a sweatshop full of children. In 1982, it seemed like the ADL would get exactly what they wanted when Alonzo Mann, in his old age, came forward with a statement. He'd lied in 1913 during his sworn testimony. He corrected the record, saying that on April 26, 1913, when he was a 14-year-old office boy at the National Pencil Company, he witnessed Jim Conley carrying the body of Mary Fagan. And when Conley realized he'd been caught, he threatened Mann's life, saying that if he told anyone, he'd kill him. So 67 years after Frank was lynched, Mann came clean, which started the process of the ADL petitioning for a pardon. But what the ADL considered a bombshell only confirmed Conley's testimony. He was an accomplice to the murder. An appeal to tribalism would have you believe that an innocent man was lynched for a crime he didn't commit because of anti-Semitism. An appeal to common sense leads you in a different direction. Mary Fagan obviously didn't write her own murder notes, so if Jim Conley was really the one guilty of homicide, then why would he implicate himself in the notes? Isn't it more logical to consider that Conley was probably paid by the real murderer to write those notes in the aftermath of Mary's death, assuring Conley that the physical description of a long, tall black night witch would fit the physical description of Newt Lee, who they both knew would be the one to discover Mary's body the following morning. Pair that common sense explanation with the forensic and circumstantial evidence, character witnesses, and the ever-changing personal testimony that eventually planted Leo Frank at the scene of the crime at the time of Mary's death, and that's how a unanimous guilty verdict was reached. The ADL has been praised for their efforts to protect individuals and groups from bias, discrimination, and hate, which has landed the ADL's education materials in the curriculums of public schools, granted them the opportunity to provide training within the police system, and given them sway in the boardrooms of media conglomerates and leading technology monopolies, like Google, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook. The scope of their influence cannot be understated. On the flip side, criticism of the ADL involves them being an anti-Gentile, pro-Israel group masquerading as a progressive civil rights organization, which promotes the us versus them narrative that once only consisted of Gentile versus Jew, but has now expanded to men versus women, black versus white, straight versus gay, pretty much any divisive agenda imaginable. The ADL champions. Then labels any criticism against the group they claim to protect as hate speech. But the ADL doesn't really protect these groups. It harms them. It exploits them. It teaches them to view themselves as victims of a hostile world. Without victimhood, without racial provocation, the ADL has no need to exist. So how much of the hatred is real and how much is manufactured? This criticism, along with that line of questioning, is labeled, you guessed it, anti-Semitism. While Frank was posthumously pardoned in 1986, he was not absolved. Over 100 years after the death of Mary Fagan, and the ADL is still trying to get Frank exonerated. But this time they have the help of Freemason attorney and former Georgia Governor Roy Barnes, who has outspokenly advocated for the case to be re-examined. Not much has changed, has it? And who benefits from this pardon? Not Mary Fagan, and not Leo Frank. I don't know if you've noticed, but they're both very dead. However, it does benefit the ADL. They have become the thing they claim to hate. A Stasi-like entity that seeks not only to censor speech, but thought as well. Leo Frank's pardon, in a way, brings legitimacy to their creation and endorses their efforts. Today, we find ourselves stuck between yesterday and tomorrow, sandwiched between the corpses of Mary Fagan and Leo Frank, in a coffin so subtle that most of us don't realize we're lying there, remaining silent when we should say something. Most people are good people, just doing the best they can, regardless of their race, gender, or belief system. They are subject to programming and manipulation. Their bodies succumb to illness. They want the best for their families, just like me and you. It is only a sliver of a percentage of individuals who commit acts of evil. They are not honest about who they are, and instead they construct illusions to shield themselves from jagged truths that bleed out of a past once buried. And that is the crux of the matter. So, internet friends, Leo Frank, still guilty after all this time? This video is highly sourced with materials from both sides of the argument, so please take a look at the top pinned comment with my source list if you wish to reach your own conclusion. As always, you know I look forward to reading your comments. Thank you so much for watching, subscribing, and supporting my channel on Patreon. Bye!